Okay, thank you, Ed. Confronting hidden threats to sustainability. By that, we basically mean unexpected or underappreciated dimensions of the various environmental challenges that we as a human civilization on this planet face. And I'm afraid I think I'll probably live up to the expectations that actually Ed mentioned, Worldwatch sort of giving people the bad news. So I will give you a fair bit of bad news, but I think, it's probably best to just see that as sort of an introduction, a prelude to some of the solutions. And I think some of the individual speakers that follow will at least give you a hint of the things that can and need to be done. So over the last few decades, as a species, we have gradually come to understand that we are depleting resources at an unsustainable rate. We are spreading dangerous pollutants, undermining ecosystems, and now, of course, the biggest threat of them all, really beginning to unhinge the planet's climate balance. This has been, in many ways, an ongoing process of scientific discovery, trying to understand what we're actually doing to this planet of ours. And it's been difficult because environmental change is not something that is linear or proceeds quite the way we might expect. Very often we have unexpected discontinuities, synergisms, feedback loops, and cascading effects. Now, I'm not going to go into what all of these terms mean. If you're interested, Chapter 1 very briefly talks about that and lays that out a little bit. The difficulty does not really stop with the scientific process. It's, scientific understanding needs to be translated into a roadmap of sorts for society, into do's and don'ts. A new contract with the planet, as it were. And that, if we look back at the experience of the last few decades, has really not been an easy process by and large. I want to give you just three examples. I'm sorry. Sorry about that. I'm drinking out of unsustainable plastic here. The first example concerns leaded gasoline. Gasoline was deliberately added to gasoline back in the 1920s. By about the 1960s, scientists began to understand what that really did to human health. They were forming quite a clear picture. But it actually took, here in the US, until the late 1970s, until lead was being phased out of gasoline. Elsewhere, it took even longer. And so by about 2011, I think more or less all of the countries in the world finally got to the point where lead was no longer part of gasoline. So it took decades and decades and decades. But the good news is, when we finally did it, it now gets us to a situation where we save about 1.2 million lives every year that otherwise would be lost. That's a good accomplishment, right? I mean, it took us a while, but we did it. Next example is photochemical smog, which is derived from vehicular and industrial emissions, and really became first a problem in the 1950s. When you think of the experience in Los Angeles, for example. Now, over the decades since then, air pollution control measures did make a dent in that situation. We did address the situation, but it is one that actually continues to be a problem. In many cities of the world, particularly those in emerging countries, developing countries, smog is still something that harms and kills a lot of people. So it's not quite the success story as with lead. We've made some progress, but we've got a ways to go. Again, it just shows the incredible time lag between scientific discovery and the political process that needs to happen to say, okay, what do we do? Third example concerns chlorofluorocarbons. These were, as you probably all know, initially very highly priced. They're, for their versatile use, they can be used as refrigerants, propellants, flame retardants, and other uses. From the mid-1970s on, again, scientists began to understand what that actually does to the ozone layer. But it took until 1987 for the so-called Montreal Protocol to come into force. So governments really getting together internationally and agreeing on a path toward phasing out CFCs globally. The result has been very, very successful. I think we're down at least 96% from the levels that we once pumped into the atmosphere. And that's good, but it will still take the ozone layer itself several more decades to heal. Scientists now expect that by the middle of this century, we'll actually be back to a healthy ozone layer. So it just, to me, it's really a striking example of not just the time lag, how long it takes for societies, for governments, for everybody, for the private sector to respond in the way needed. But then even if you take the corrective action, sometimes, like with CFCs, it's not just important to start doing the right thing, but you also have to allow it time. And I think that's certainly true for climate change as well. And needless to say, with regard to climate change, we face a very similar kind of situation, right? I mean, back in the 1960s and 1970s, scientists sort of started to know what we were doing to the planet's climate system. There wasn't the kind of certainty that we have nowadays. If you look at the report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right, in 2013, they said, or they concluded, it is extremely likely that human influence has been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century. Right, so back in the 60s and 70s, that certainty wasn't there, the consensus wasn't there. But it's quite interesting when you look at the proceedings of a conference in 1979, which was held by the World Meteorological Organization. The language back then was essentially the same as now, except the scientists were hedging a little bit because they weren't totally sure. But they said, I think we know what's going on here. So the language has not changed much, except now, they can say, we're pretty much certain about this. There aren't really any big outstanding questions anymore. So, but what has happened, as we all know, governments and corporations have by and large really dragged their feet. It's been a very, very difficult process. It continues to be a difficult process. Everybody's looking to Paris at the end of this year for the climate deal. Let's hope they strike one. Let's hope. But even while we wait for this, right, even while we wait for governments to finally do what they need to do, we come to realize that there are still many, many unforeseen or unexpected consequences of this process that we have started. So these relate to forests, oceans, the Arctic, and agricultural resources. New research suggests that the ability of the Amazon forest in Brazil to absorb carbon is weakening over time. A recent study found that the uptake of carbon has fallen about by half since the 1990s. And while higher CO2 levels trigger plant growth, the problem also appears to be that the trees don't live as long. So we really don't gain much by pumping more CO2 into the air, even in that way. The oceans have also sequestered much of the carbon that we emit, slowing the rise in surface temperatures. But as chapter 6 explains, carbon absorption is changing the acidity of ocean waters, with as yet unknown but probably really problematic impacts on the marine food web. New research also finds that the oceans have been heating much faster than previously thought. And so once they start to release some of that excess energy, I think we can pretty much expect that the rise in temperature that we already know is happening is likely to accelerate. Rapid Arctic warming is expected now to lead to the thawing of at least parts of the permafrost. And of course, the permafrost contains massive stores of carbon. This could lead to a dangerous feedback loop in that it would trigger more emissions of CO2 and methane. That in turn leads to more warming, and then the more warming, of course, just continues the cycle. So you got the picture. The problem is the IPCC doesn't even really take that into account in its current scenarios. So we might actually be far worse off than the IPCC tells us right now. And they're being cautious, of course. There's scientific caution that's at work in what they do. Now, a destabilized climate, along with the degradation of key agricultural resources, land and water, threatens to undermine the ability of countries to feed themselves. In this context, Chapter 5 considers pros and cons of a food import strategy, and Gary Gardner will talk about that following my introduction. Hidden threats do not just lurk in the physical world, but they also translate into human concerns such as health and economic well-being. One still underappreciated danger is found in emerging diseases. Human activities disrupt ecological systems, increasing the likelihood that infectious disease will spread from animals to humans. So in this context, there are things like land use changes, intensive livestock operations, the heavy use of antibiotics in animals. Those are some of the key concerns. Catherine Machalaba, who is a co-author of Chapter 8, is here with us, and she will talk about this later in the program following Gary's remarks. Another still underappreciated danger relates to possible population displacements due to climate change impacts. Now, the speed, the direction, and the extent of such population movements are basically the stuff of conjecture at this point. We really just don't know how this might play out, how many people might get displaced and what they will do or not do. But it is possible, certainly, that such movements of displaced people could trigger growing competition over resources, over jobs, over social services, and so on. And this could very well, in weak societies, undermine the social fabric. Chapter 9, which was written by François Gemène, but who's unfortunately not with us today, argues that migration can in fact be a suitable adaptation measure in response to climate change impacts. But he says that policies are needed to help communities become more resilient, so that the likelihood of displacement is less high. That policies are needed to make adaptation a viable option, and actually adaptation both in place, people in communities who do not go anywhere else, but also those who choose or who are forced to move. Now, let me also just briefly refer to what's going to be the final part of our program today. Chapters 2, 3, and 4 explore various facets relating to economic growth and its consequences. Growth is widely regarded as indispensable, yet few people recognize that growth drives most of our environmental problems. And most likely it will need to be abandoned as the central goal of our economy. Nate Hagans and Peter Victor are here to present their perspectives in the concluding panel of the day. I want to mention one more thing that relates to Chapter 4. Continued investments in a fossil fuel-centered energy system, and especially in such extreme forms of energy as shale oil and gas, Arctic oil, tar sands, and so on, are designed to maintain this notion, this goal of endless growth, but really will essentially lock societies into a dead-end scenario. It's becoming clearer that the bulk of the world's proven fossil fuel reserves have to stay in the ground. They cannot be touched if we are to have any chance of keeping climate change to manageable limits, and the question is, what is manageable anyway? So we have a chapter in the book, Chapter 4, that in part addresses that issue. What happens if we keep investing in these kinds of things? Will that not lead to what economists call stranded assets? One of the good things about this chapter is it doesn't just look at impacts related to climate change, but it points out that in very many different ways, we run that same risk. We have to be very careful, and I think we have to be more visionary in terms of where do we invest? What is the right direction to go into? And this is really something that society at large needs to debate far more than it has to this point in time. So a few thoughts in concluding. What is required, it seems, and Worldwatch actually has been saying this for a long time, is to go beyond piecemeal approaches. We need really far-reaching social, economic, and political changes in order to deal with the challenges before us. A key challenge is to reorient the economy away from the goal of endless material growth, to replace GDP as the key measure that everybody looks at. But I think most of all, what we need is not to have a repeat of this incredible time lag, from the point of scientific realization of what is actually happening to this planet to the point where the political systems and economic systems of this earth, swing into action and do the right thing. So we need urgent and timely action. Environmentalists have for the longest time pointed this out with regard to climate change, right? I mean, we and others have been calling for mitigation measures a long, long time ago. Well, we all know by this point that these calls were by and large not heeded. And so we have gotten to the point where, well, we can't just do mitigation anymore. Now we also have to think about adaptation. All right. We are, I think, now in danger of sort of running through that process again, of not getting behind things and not doing things fast enough, so that we may, and I hope that's not the case, but that we may actually get to the point where adaptation alone is not the only option anymore, and that we may end up, for certain parts of this planet and certain parts of the communities on this earth, where it's not adaptation, but really suffering and in effect a form of triage. Let's not go there. I think that's one of the key messages that underline not just this year's report, but probably all of the work that we have done here over the years. Now, I think I've lived up to the old Worldwatch approach of giving you the bad news. So I hope that some of the following speakers will not just give you a totally dark picture, but also offer some of the solutions they have come up with in their respective chapters.